Morning, and we thank our next guest for spending a few minutes with us in studio. Congressman Michael Guest joins us this morning. He represents the 3rd District of Mississippi. Good morning, Mr. Congressman.
Good morning, Richard. Great to be home with you this week.
Absolutely. Glad to have you back in the great state of Mississippi. So many directions I'd like for us to go, and we really do appreciate your time. Washington, D.C. is an interesting town. And people,
it's an understatement.
I think that's a good way to describe it. People talk, and like there's the local rumor mill, and sometimes the D.C., the way information gets around is a little bit different than the way it gets around in the rest of the country. I was talking with someone who works in D.C. yesterday, and there seems to be a calmness and a confidence on the Republican side of things that not only is Donald Trump going to win this election, but that there is a very legitimate chance that the GOP at the very least wins the Senate, but perhaps a majority in the House as well. I think some of that can be optimism, and some of that can be misconstrued. But can you tell us a little bit more about what the feeling is in D.C. as you talk with your colleagues, as you hear from lobbyists, other people that work on the Hill?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And first of all, I do share that optimism, and just want to kind of give our listeners here today a kind of a snapshot of where we are 3 weeks out from the election. And I think starting with the United States Senate, I think that is the easiest of the three bodies that we mentioned, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and then the election of our commander-in-chief. If you look at the United States Senate, for Republicans to regain the majority in the Senate, they need a net pickup of 2 seats. And there is a lot of polling that is available that we have been able to sift through. And I will tell you that from what I'm hearing on the ground, the polling that I'm seeing, the people that I'm talking to, I am confident that Republicans will pick up, in my opinion, 3 seats. We will win West Virginia, which will be an easy pickup for Republicans. We will win Montana, and those 2 seats alone will give us a 51-49 seat majority. But I also feel good that we'll win either the state of Ohio or the state of Wisconsin. Both of those, the polling in those states has narrowed pretty dramatically to the point that the Democrats in those 2 states only have a 1-point majority in both Ohio and Wisconsin. I think Trump is going to bring out a great deal of voters. I think there's a great deal of enthusiasm by Republicans to go to the polls to vote to reelect Donald Trump. I think that is going to bring out a huge number of voters and will increase voter turnout on the Republican side. So I'm very optimistic, very confident about the Senate. I think turning to the House of Representatives, the polling is less available in the House of Representatives, but some of those same trends hold true. The voter turnout, voter enthusiasm is going to be high for Republicans. 3 states to watch as we're seeing election returns come in on the 5th that will probably determine which party controls the majority in the House of Representatives are the states of New York, California, and Iowa. Now, I know that New York and California are traditionally blue states, but there are pockets of red in those major Democrat hubs.
Upstate New York, western New York, very rural areas that look a lot and feel a lot like Mississippi, and then that farming country, Fresno, Northern California, Eastern California, those are areas that are very different than the city parts of those states.
That's right. Very, very different than downtown New York or downtown Los Angeles or downtown San Francisco. You're exactly right. And so there are conservatives in those states, and we have Republicans who are currently in those seats today. Now, I will tell you that those Republicans are being vastly outspent by their Democratic opponents. In some cases, they're being outspent 2-1. But if we can hold the Republican seats that we have in California, hold the Republican seats we have in New York, and the 2 seats in Iowa, I feel, again, confident that not only will we keep the majority in the House, but we'll grow that majority. I think we'll pick up a seat in the state of Alaska. I will pick up seats in North Carolina after some of the redistricting there that was done by the federal court. And so I think Republicans, again, should feel optimistic as we go into these House elections that we stand a better chance than not of maintaining control of the House and actually growing that majority. And then the race that everybody truly cares about is the election of our commander-in-chief. I will tell you that the momentum has shifted. I think that when Kamala Harris got into the race the way that she did, she had a good convention. I think that she got an immediate bump with that, that momentum had swung into her favor. But over the last week and a half, Republicans have retaken that momentum. Donald Trump has done a great job. I think for all of your listeners who watched J.D. Vance as he gave the talking points during the vice presidential debate, being able to clearly contrast what Republicans stand for versus Democrats, to remind Republicans that Kamala Harris is not an agent of change, that she's had 3.5 years to implement all of these policies that she's spewing on the campaign trail, and she's done none of those. And then when she got on The View and was asked a very softball question, hey, what would you change? And her answer was something to the effect of, well, nothing really comes to mind right now. I'm sure you've played that clip repeatedly, Richard, to your audience. And so we see that there are going to be 7 swing states, and in 6 of those 7 swing states, as we sit here today, 3 weeks out, Donald Trump has the lead. The only state that he currently is trailing right now is in the state of Wisconsin, and those being the 7 swing states, and only by 0.3%. And so this election is going to be razor close. I don't believe we're going to know election night who our president's going to be. I don't believe we're going to know election night what party is going to control the House of Representatives. But I'll tell you that I feel better about where Republicans sit right now than I have in the last several weeks, and I think that momentum is going to continue to grow through November the 5th.
So based on what we saw in 2020, it's reasonable to think that we won't have a decision in Georgia, we won't have a decision in Pennsylvania on the night of the election. So what is the path to Donald Trump? If we are to know an outcome on Election Day, election night, North Carolina gets done, Ohio gets done, Arizona,
Michigan.
Michigan maybe finishes that night, and if you get those 4, it's probably enough.
Yeah, if those 4, if we can determine the winner of those 4 states, and if all those states are in Donald Trump's category, I think that he could be declared the winner late the night on the 5th or early the morning of the 6th.
Okay.
If not, I think we're going to see that there's going to be some time. I think with the recent storms we saw in North Carolina and Georgia, that is going to complement or complicate matters somewhat because
Sure.
I think you're going to have more people than traditionally would vote absentee. They're going to be voting absentee because of the storm and the damage to their homes. So those states, I think, will be later coming in than what we've seen traditionally. But it would not surprise me that we don't have a clear winner when we all go to bed sometime late on the night of the 5th, early on the morning of the 6th.
Visiting with Congressman Michael Guest. Got a couple of minutes till the break. He's going to hang with us for a little while longer. I don't think you'll have time for an entire answer here, but I had a preacher years ago. He's actually the minister that married my wife and me. And in all of his sermons, he would go through what he was talking to, and then it's like, okay, how does a preacher wrap up his sermon? How does he conclude? And his thing was, so what, now what? In this election cycle, we're in the so what phase right now, right? I mean, you've got to get the votes. There is a hope that those majorities in both chambers of Congress exist for the Republicans and that Donald Trump is the winner. But my real interest is in the now what. If that happens, if there is a majority in both the House and the Senate, if there is a Republican president, what happens then? Because Republicans in recent years, I mean, you've seen it firsthand, don't always get along with themselves and sometimes kind of step on their own feet in terms of legislation and getting things done and capitalizing on momentum and sometimes even growing that momentum.
Well, first of all, if we control the White House, the House and the Senate, we'll be able to use legislative vehicles such as the reconciliation process, something that we can use that would allow us to avoid the filibuster in the Senate, that would allow us to prioritize spending, that would allow us to address the expiration of the Trump tax cuts that are coming. And then the president is going to be able to do so much by the use of executive order. And I know we've got a break, but happy to kind of expound on that, Richard, when we come back.
It's still a relative. I mean, executive order has been around for a long time, but it's a tool that has been used far more in the last 20 years or so than maybe the previous 200 years. We're going to continue our conversation with Congressman Michael Guest, represents the 3rd District of Mississippi. What does it look like if Republicans sweep? And then also some issues that are facing us directly here in Mississippi. We'll continue with the Congressman after this. This is the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk, Mississippi. Continuing our conversation with Congressman Michael Guest. This is the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk, Mississippi. We're glad to be with you on this Tuesday morning, just 3 weeks from Election Day. We'll try to pick up where we left off before the break. We were talking about executive order and governing. I should amend what I said just a little bit as we were going to the break about the number of executive orders that have been used. The president in our history that used more executive orders than any other, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was, you remember, in office for 12 years, 3,721 EOs during his time in office. Obviously, there was a lot going on during that time in office. It was an average of 307 per year. In comparison, Donald Trump, in his terms, issued 220 executive orders in his 4 years. Joe Biden has issued 142. So, Congressman Guest, we were talking about executive orders. Sometimes this is used as a workaround to get around Congress, to get something that the president really deems to be important. Sometimes there are other reasons. Talk to us a little bit about executive orders, the role that plays, and the importance of them for a president.
Yeah, the executive order process allows the president the latitude to instruct government agencies that within the administrative branch on how to carry out certain policies. One particular that was very successful that when President Trump was in office is President Trump instituted the Remain in Mexico policy, in which he ordered the Department of Homeland Security that when immigrants were coming into the country, that before those immigrants were allowed to enter the country, that they had to remain in Mexico until there was at least a base level adjudication of their asylum claims. And so if you remember, we did have, when President Trump was in office, we did have for several months a run of immigrants along our southern border. Donald Trump got together with his team. They came up with the Remain in Mexico policy, again, which did not allow immigrants to immediately enter the country, but there was a process that they had to go through before they could enter. And that process cut the number of immigrants coming into the country dramatically. Probably the most successful policy that I've seen, at least during my 6 years in Congress. The fact that just almost overnight, Richard, we were able to cut those numbers to a very manageable amount. And so Trump was able to do that without going through Congress. If anything that goes through Congress, as you know and as your listeners know, seems to take a lifetime. Things to develop consensus first within the Republican Party on where we're going to be on a particular issue, and then to get buy-in from the Senate, because even if Republicans do control a 51, 49, 52, 48 majority, they still have the filibuster rule in the Senate, which requires 60 senators to be able to start debate on many pieces of legislation. So presidents are able to use executive order administrative actions to implement change much quicker, and that's what I expect the president to do. I think you'll see administrative orders, particularly on the border and on immigration. You'll see things that he will put in place to try to deal with inflation. We've seen the impact of inflation that it has on everyday Americans, and I believe it's Congress that we will start focus immediately on the spending bills. What are our spending priorities going to be going forward? And I believe that one of our spending priorities needs to be a substantial investment in our United States military. Senator Wicker has laid out his vision that we need a generational investment. As we see a world where we see growing unrest, we see war in Europe, we see fighting in the Middle East, we see China and what they're doing in the Indo-Pacific. we need to make sure that we have the best trained, best equipped military in the world to fight not only one conflict but multiple conflicts simultaneously, and that's going to require substantial federal buy-in. And so those would be areas where I would think very early, day one, the swearing in of the new Congress, that we would start focusing. And I'll tell you that Republicans, particularly Speaker Johnson, they are preparing for a scenario where Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House, and going to look to see that we can move as much legislation as possible within those first 100 days.
Visiting with Congressman Michael Guest, represents Mississippi's 3rd District. I mean, you know, just like everybody that's listening, life is expensive right now. It's expensive to go to the grocery store. It's expensive to get gas. It's expensive to go on vacation. I would say government is expensive as well, right? I mean, it's expensive to be a global superpower and to do what you're saying in terms of, okay, if you're going to make a generational investment into the military, that's a really, really expensive proposition. The difference, I think, that a lot of people, and maybe a frustration that a lot of people have, is that if life gets too expensive for me at home, I have to figure out a way to budget and make the money that I have last. And if I spend more than I've got, then the bank's going to call, or bankruptcy becomes a thing. The United States federal government doesn't seem to operate that way, and frankly, that's whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. Is there an appetite in Congress to say, we actually are going to get the spending under control? We are going to make some cuts. We're going to use the most difficult word in the English language, no, more than we have used it in the past?
The short answer is yes. We understand that
that's the easiest word in the English language. Yeah.
The short answer is yes. That we understand that there is a spending problem. $35.5 trillion in debt. We didn't hit $1 trillion in debt, Richard, until Ronald Reagan was president. And so when Reagan was president, which I still remember in the 80s, that's when we hit that first $1 trillion in national debt. Since that time, we've added $34.5 trillion. Now, as we start looking at federal spending and where we're going to cut those programs that we're not going to fund, I want your listeners to understand that 75 cents out of every dollar that the federal government spends is not appropriated by Congress. That is mandatory spending that is on automatic pilot. That spending includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and now service of our national debt. Just debt service alone, Richard, we spend more on debt service today than we do funding our entire military. And so because of this huge debt that we've run up, because of the cost of borrowing, interest rates have gone up, America now spends more every year on debt service than we do funding and paying for our entire military, Army, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, more just on debt service. And so we have got to look at what can we do to rein in mandatory spending. And I will tell you that is very unpopular. It's very unpopular because, look, we all want the best health care in the world, right? I know I do. I want to, when I go to the doctor, when I go to a hospital, to know that I'm getting world-class health care. We want to know that we're taking care of our seniors, those that have paid into Social Security all these years, those who rely on those Social Security benefits to make ends meet every month. And we've got to service the national debt. We can't just say we're going to stop paying interest on our debt because if we do, we're no longer going to be able to borrow anymore. And so those are difficult discussions, but those are discussions that I think Congress is ready to have. And so we've got to look and say, what can we shave off on the discretionary side, on that 25% that Congress controls? And half of that 25% is military spending. And so if you take military spending out, you take mandatory spending out, Congress really only controls about 12 to 13% of federal spending. Wow. And I know that is something that most people don't recognize. And so we've got to establish a bipartisan, bicameral committee that is going to look at what we can do to get the mandatory spending under control, because until we can cap mandatory spending, we can cut all day long on the discretionary side, but we're still not going to be able to balance the budget. We're still going to be increasing that national debt, and we're going to be passing those costs along to our children and grandchildren.
Which is a scary proposition because that debt does not get any smaller, and that interest calculator doesn't stop spinning either. That continues to make it go. Visiting with Congressman Michael Guest, just a couple of minutes left. Helene and Milton wreaked havoc in the Southeast. We are extremely fortunate to have missed this time, at least so far in hurricane season in the state of Mississippi, but no strangers to the devastation that comes along with storms. So much has been talked about FEMA. Is the funding there that they need? Is Congress going to authorize what is necessary to help Florida, Western North Carolina, South Carolina, Northern Georgia, Eastern Tennessee? And was the response good enough? And can all of those be true? Like maybe the response wasn't good enough, and yet they're still kind of doing their job?
I will tell you that coming out of the chute, the response was not adequate.
Okay.
I will tell you that FEMA was caught off guard, particularly much of the flooding that we saw inland. I think FEMA was prepared as Helene was coming into Florida, that knowing that they were going to have to respond there to that curve, that bend there in Florida, and they were prepared to do that. But they did not foresee the flooding that we're going to have, the damage in North Carolina, in Tennessee, and Georgia, and they did a very poor job of responding to that. Now, as far as funding, they have the funding to meet the immediate needs. Will there have to be some sort of disaster supplemental to look at the long-term cost to repair many of these areas that were so badly damaged? The answer to that is yes. I've heard that damage estimates may run up to $100 billion. So just as we talk about federal spending and the need to be good stewards of the taxpayer money, we also know that we must help Americans in their time of need.
Congressman Guest, thank you for your time. Always enjoy the conversations.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate you.
We'll take a quick time out. This is the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk, Mississippi.